This year, KHOU 11 is celebrating its 70th anniversary. That's why I sat down with one of our alumni, journalist and anchorman Dan Rather. Right now, you're about to see a story about Dan's history at the station, and then we'll share with you my interview with him.
I would also say that it was one of the best times of my professional life.
Dan Rather talking about his time at KHOU 11 in 1960 and 61, when KHOU didn't even have the equipment to develop the film they shot.
In news, we would shoot film, let's say, of a police incident, bring the film to a processor downtown who would process it, and then bring it back to the station to edit it.
It was a radically different time when anchoring a newscast was truly multitasking. He had hidden buttons he'd press, going down his right shirt sleeve and his left sleeve.
So therefore, I would look the camera in the eye and say, today we did an interview with the mayor, and he had this to say. And I would press my left hand and roll the news tape. It was over and I said, and that's what the mayor had to say. Now, we were back with more news after these messages, and then I'd press the button with my right hand.
Sid Lasher was his weatherman, and in Houston's news ratings war, back then, KHOU was, well, not exactly dominant.
In a 3-station market, we were a very bad 5.
But that would soon change.
Here is Dan Rather speaking directly from Galveston.
Evacuation should be hastened before it is too late.
Hurricane Carla in September of 61. Rather's idea was to broadcast from Galveston, where the National Weather Service had the only radar in the area.
There is the eye of the hurricane right there.
He layered a transparent map over the radar and the hurricane.
We'll be back with you with the next bulletin on Hurricane Carla,
which changed the way weather is done on every station in the country.
It resulted in more than 300,000 people evacuating the coast.
After that, our viewership expanded tremendously.
Well, they also say that your coverage and the station's coverage saved thousands of lives during that hurricane.
Well, that's what the Weather Bureau said, and that's a fact.
The next year, the network came calling. He wanted to stay at KHOU, but to quote the film The Godfather,
CBS News offered me the proverbial, made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
But the man who grew up in the Heights here in Houston and went on to report on the major stories of our lives never forgets his hometown or KHOU 11, or the building that stood for years on Allen Parkway. The studios lost to Hurricane Harvey flooding.
In thinking about doing this interview with you, Ron, I thought about the fact that I never thought that I would outlive the new KHOU building on Allen Parkway.
But we're still around, just not on Allen Parkway, and so is Dan Rather, just not in Houston, though not too far away in Austin. He loves H-Town.
Houston has always had a can-do attitude about it. It should be known as the can-do city.
Dan Rather's own can-do spirit, a big part of the 70-year history of KHOU as well. Ron Trevino, KHOU 11 News.
Well, Dan Rather, first of all, the reason we're here is KHOU 11 is turning 70 years old this year.
Hard for me to believe.
But you were there in the early days.
I was. That the station had started as a Galveston station, as you probably know, KHOU. Mm-hmm. I arrived just as the station was being revived under a new ownership, the Corinthian Broadcasting System, and moved to becoming a full-fledged Houston station. It went through a phase where it was Galveston station, then became a Galveston-Houston station, then a Houston-Galveston station, and then the first thing you know, Houston station. But when I arrived in 1960, I had been working in Houston radio since I got out of the Marines in 1954. At any rate, they hired me to be their anchor and news director. But news director meant mostly directing myself. So get the picture here. I'm new to television. I knew virtually nothing about television. My early career was spent in newspapers, wire services. The picture I'm painting for you is I knew nothing about television, but I knew news. I sat down and I ad-libbed a 15-minute newscast for them. And they had hired a program director, Corinthian head from Pittsburgh, named C. Calvin Jones, and who was a big-time, very talented program director. And he was in charge of this tryout. And as soon as I'd finished, he said, how soon can we get you? So I came in early 1960. Keep in mind, when I came to KHOU in the very beginning, Houston was not the Houston of today. It was beginning to be the Houston of today, but just the beginning. It was just in the early stages of working itself out of being a very medium-sized town working on a big town. Television, and particularly television news, were in their early stages. That color television had just come in. When I came to the newsroom at KHOU, and I was listed as director of news and community events, but I was one person. We had a part-time cameraman. We shot film. Videotape was known, but portable videotape was virtually unknown. So in film has to be processed. KHOU did not have its own processing. So in news, we would shoot film, let's say, of a police incident, bring the film to a processor downtown who would process it, and then bring it back to the station to edit it. I had never edited film before, didn't know anything about it. Bob Leafy at the station taught me with a cold splicer to splice the film. Yeah. At 10 o'clock at night, the engineer was in the building. Sid Lasher would come in and do the weather, and I was there by myself. Down my left sleeve was a button that would roll news tape. Down my right sleeve was a button that would roll commercials. So therefore, I would look the camera in the eye and say, today we did an interview with the mayor, and he had this to say. And I would press my left hand and roll the news tape. When it was over, and I said, and that's what the mayor had to say. Now, we'll be back with more news after these messages, and then I'd press the button with my right hand. And I don't want to, trying hard here not to be conceited or arrogant or anything. In some ways we were lucky, in other ways we made our own luck. But when we started in 1960, KHOU, which had been purchased by Corinthian Broadcasting, in a 3-station market, we were a very bad 5. We used to joke, but it wasn't that far off the mark, that test patterns got more ratings than we got most of the time with our newscasts. But with the help of everybody at the station, we established a reputation for being, knowing the city and for hustling hard.
And then Hurricane Carla came around.
When Hurricane Carla came in September of 1961, the whole television game changed in Houston in very important ways. That we went to Galveston, and Galveston, the Weather Bureau there had a radar. Shows you how long ago this has been. That no station in the country had their own radar at that time. Even the Weather Bureau was just now installing radar in key places. And because we knew that radar was in Galveston, as I said to the leadership of the station, let's go to Galveston and see what we can find at the Weather Bureau there. And at any rate, as the big hurricane came, we were the only people in Galveston. We were cut off from the island. And we did come up with the idea of superimposing a map over the picture of the hurricane, which changed the way weather is done on every station in the country. Our coverage was such, and again, I want to make sure that it wasn't just myself. At the whole station at KHOU, I wish I could name every person there. I can still name probably a dozen people from those people. They had we're coming from behind attitude about the station as a whole as being something that the community could be proud of. And with the courage, with the coverage of the great hurricane, everybody pulled together. And, you know, because I was the anchor person and the sole anchor, naturally attention focused on me. But I want to emphasize that there were so many people who did so much to make our coverage of Hurricane Carla what it was in that September of 1961 period. But because we were the only ones in Galveston, we'd gone ahead and the island got cut off, our coverage was picked up by radio stations and other television stations along the Gulf Coast. And it did result, our coverage did result in the Weather Bureau convincing people to get off the coast. But that was the story of the big hurricane. And after that, our viewership expanded tremendously.
Well, they also say that your coverage and the station's coverage saved thousands of lives during that hurricane.
Well, that's what the Weather Bureau said, and that's a fact. That's true. And it established a thing I think is noteworthy, not in the way of trying to call attention to ourselves, was noteworthy. It set a new way of covering major storms, a new way of helping to convince people you need to get out of the lowlands and get out of the way. These days it's routine.
Yeah, but back then that was a brilliant idea.
Well, yes, is the short answer to that. Because people said, wow, this is a real monster, and they're not kidding when they say we better get out. KHOU's reputation as a news station leaped, and with that came an audience. And frankly, afterward, the station manager, a man named Jim Richdale, tried very hard to get me to stay in Houston, and I was inclined to stay, but CBS News offered me the proverbial, made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and so I left. But you know, for our purposes here, Ron, and I don't want to talk your ear off about it, but for every local station, you and I know, you've been around the business a long time, that leadership of the station makes a difference. Jim Richdale, the manager of KHOU at the time of Hurricane Carla, B. Calvin Jones, who was the program director, Bob Levy, who was a man about the station, jack of all trades, and a long list of other people, really made the station develop from, frankly, not a very good property, not a very good television property, and not a very good citizen of the community, into a very valuable television property and a very valuable member of the community. And the one reason I mention that is because I remember very well, I mentioned Jim Richdale was the manager of the station. He was a proper Bostonian. What he knew about hurricanes could be written on the back of a postage stamp. But when I came to B. Calvin Jones, who was my boss, and said, we need to go to Galveston to cover this hurricane, we had to go to Richdale because it involved a good deal of money and also no small amount of risk. And Richdale listened and gave him, this is what I'm talking about, leadership. He said, well, Dan, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, really. But if you think we should do it, then we do it. And the other time, I could make a long list of times when leadership of the station made a difference. Richdale, Jones. When at the time, remember, the civil rights movement was just beginning to take traction in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And there was Houston, remember, was staunchly segregated. It wasn't Mississippi or Alabama, but there was institutionalized racism. The schools were separated. The town in many ways was split apart. And the power structure of the city, which had been there quite some time, was concerned about coverage of the civil rights movement. And frankly, they took the attitude this was the power structure of the town, took the attitude, if it comes to Houston, sit-ins at cafes and protests and things, if nobody covers it, it won't take traction. So there was a movement to get the television stations and everybody to agree that when the civil rights sit-ins and that sort of thing began happening here, we'd just shut it down. And I attended a meeting in which that was was pretty much laid out. Mm-hmm. And when it came to me, I said, I can't make this decision. I can tell you what, I don't think it'll work, but I'll take it back. When I took it back to Jim Richdale, the manager of the station, I don't know what their decision would have been, but I know what Richdale's decision was. He looked me right square in the eyes, Texas fashion, and said, Dan, what do you think? And I said, well, it's a damn fool idea. He said, I absolutely agree, you go back and tell them so. Well, I didn't go back and tell them it was a damn fool idea, but I told them that KHOU, Corinthian Broadcasting, and Jim Richdale, the station manager, would not have any part of it. Mm-hmm. That took guts, and he had them. Mm-hmm. And the point being, it was that kind of leadership mm-hmm. that eventually took KHOU, Channel 11, from being a bad 5 in a 3-station market to being a very valuable member of the community.
So you're proud. You're proud of KHOU 11, 70 years, and your contribution to the legacy.
Yes, I'm proud of my contribution, whatever it may have been, but again, emphasizing that a lot of people mm-hmm. made that happen. It wasn't just myself. Right. But I am proud of what we accomplished during that time. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that it was one of the best times of my professional life. Looking back on it, I had more fun because we were coming from behind, fighting from behind, hustling, mm-hmm. driving, believing in ourselves. And television news, when I came to KHOU, was still in something of its infancy. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knew how to do it. Mm-hmm. We were making it up as we went along.
Yeah, doing a good job of it. Let's talk about you growing up in Houston and growing up in the Houston area. Do you have like fond memories of those times?
I grew up in Houston, mm-hmm. in the Houston Heights, at a time when the Houston Heights was known pretty generally as a, quote, tough neighborhood. It's all gentrified today and completely different. I went to public schools. I went to Love Elementary School, Hamilton Junior High School, what was then John Reagan High School, now it's called Heights High again. I was a Depression baby, born during the Depression. My parents were terrific parents. My father worked with his back and his hands most of his life. My mother worked out of the home sometimes with odd jobs, waitressing and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But I had a good, what we used to be called nuclear family, if you will. So childhood was happy for me until I contracted rheumatic fever when I was about 11 years old, 10 to 11 years old. Rheumatic fever at the time there was no known cure. It was second to polio as every mother's nightmare. And because there was no cure, there's a cure for it now. But, so what they did was put me to bed and say, have him move as little as possible because they were worried about affecting the heart. Mm-hmm. So for the better part of 2.5 years, I was bedridden, ages 11, 12, into 13, which was clearly not a happy time. In some ways I was lucky. You could say, well, doesn't sound very lucky to go to bed for that long as a child. Mm-hmm. But the radio was my constant companion. Day and night, I listened to the radio. Mm-hmm. And the war was on. The war started in 1941 when I was 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And I listened to the voices of the great radio reporters, Ed Murrow, Charles Collingwood, Eric Severide, and grew up listening to them reporting from faraway places with strange sounding names, mm-hmm. doing what I thought was very exciting work. Then when the rheumatic fever finally passed, and it did just pass, there was no cure for it. It just sort of eventually went away. And it did not leave me with a heart problem. Then I got back to trying to get myself back to normal life, if you will. But I had missed a lot of school. Mm-hmm. There was an effort to homeschool me, but it was not very successful. And I had a little bit of difficulty getting myself back into school and back into pattern, but eventually did. And my dream had been to play football, and one of the formative parts of my life was getting to play. I played at what was then Reagan. We played on Friday nights before 28,000 people at Old Jefferson Stadium. And I played sometimes fairly well, sometimes not so well, but I played in lettered and under the late Coach Lamar Camp. And those two things stand out in my childhood as helping to define me. One, having had rheumatic fever, and two, realizing how tough it would be to letter in football and managing to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And then you moved on to Sam Houston State University. I
did. I went to what was then Sam Houston State Teachers College in Huntsville. The first summer I was there, I think the population was 900. It was a much smaller school. Now it's a great state university. Those days it was a small teachers college. And I went in hopes and in belief that I could make my way through school winning a football scholarship. That was not to be, and it was pretty clear early on that I wasn't going to make the team, and I didn't think I could stay in college. But luck and God's grace delivered to me that rarity, a really good teacher who cared. Professor Hugh Cunningham, who was the journalism professor at Sam Houston, sort of took me under his wing. I literally slept on the couch of his home my first semester to keep myself in school, and he got me some odd jobs that would keep me in school, and so I managed to stay at Sam Houston for 3 years, but the Korean War was on, and I know it sounds archaic, but I was actually afraid I was going to miss the war. I know that would strike a lot of people as strange, but remember, it's 1950s, not that long after World War II ended. But at any rate, I wanted to serve my country, I wanted to fight for my country. And so I joined the Marines. But they found out that I had rheumatic fever, so I have one of the shortest and least distinguished records in the whole history of the United States Marine Corps. But the best I can say is I volunteered during the war and did the best I could to serve.
What happens now when you visit Houston and you compare it to the city you grew up in and the city it is now? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm very proud of Houston. I've always been proud of Houston, but I'm particularly proud of Houston now. Houston is a great international city now. When I came to KHOU in 1960, it was beginning. You could see the beginnings of that, but it wasn't there. And among the reasons I'm so proud of Houston is, first of all, it's one of the most diverse, extra-large cities in the country, and it's handled its diversity well. Not perfectly. It's not perfect now. It hasn't been perfect getting to where it is now. But it's an extremely diverse city that seems to get along, gets along with itself pretty well. And it's handled its growth, I think, very well. And I'll tell you this, anybody who comes to Houston and doesn't recognize the kindness and decency overall in the main in Houston has missed something very important. That Houston has always had a can-do attitude about it. It should be known as the can-do city.
So, you know, we had the flooding from Harvey, and the building on 1945 Allen Parkway is no longer there. But we stayed on the air, and we have a new, we're in a new building now. What are your thoughts on seeing that old edifice there on 1945 Allen Parkway gone now?
In thinking about doing this interview with you, Ron, I thought about the fact that I never thought that I would outlive the new KHOU building on Allen Parkway. When we moved in there from the quarters high atop the Prudential Insurance Building on South Main, we were so proud of this new facility by Allen Parkway. And I remember speaking at the dedication of it. that we were so proud of it. It never occurred to me that I could possibly outlive this building. And it's hard for me to visualize KHOU not being on Allen Parkway. With Hurricane Harvey and how the station handled itself, it's hard for me to fully express how much I admired everybody at the station at the time. And I will tell you, I ached to come down. And particularly, I could see what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And my wife, Jean, frankly, kind of made it clear I could either go to KHOU during the time of Harvey or have a wife. But it's not likely that I could go to Houston in the teeth of Hurricane Harvey and have a wife. She also pointed out that at my age and stage, I'd be nothing but a burden on the station, so I didn't go. But I followed the whole thing, and I give everybody who was involved at the station at the time of Harvey a badge of courage. Mm-hmm. The station handled itself magnificently, mm-hmm. and it spoke miles to the courage of the people. We've talked in this interview earlier about some of the leadership skills and the leadership that was examples that were given when I worked at the station in the early 60s. But at the time of Harvey, there was terrific leadership, and everybody did their part. And I hope there's a plaque. If there isn't one, there should be one somewhere in the station, mm-hmm. with the time and date when the station reached that point where it could say to itself, we met a tough situation, and we gave it everything we had. And it was a good example of courage under pressure.
What do you do these days, Dan? We know you have the newsletter. What do you do for fun? What do you do for work? What do you do?
Well, as we speak, I'm 91 years old, will be 92 in October. And frankly, a good deal of my life these days is trying to keep myself fit. Mm-hmm. I've had health challenges. Who doesn't have health challenges at this age and stage? But meeting those health challenges and trying to keep myself physically and mentally and spiritually as strong as I can takes up a good deal of my time. Mm-hmm. I love to fly fish. I haven't been fly fishing for a while, mm-hmm. But I love the outdoors. I love to read, and I still stay active. I do a newsletter on Substack, mm-hmm. called Steady. Yes, I still watch television. I watch the evening news. I watch all three main evening news. And of course, I critique them. Mm-hmm. It'll come as no surprise to you that I talk back to the television set some nights saying, how could you possibly lead with that? Or why did you give this story all that much time? Wow. What I will say that I think all three of the major network newscasts, they've changed dramatically, as almost everything in the news business has. But I give them all credit because they're all doing the best they can.
Once a newsman, always a newsman in a way.
No question about it.
And your newsletter is a way for you to convey your thoughts after a life well lived in news.
Well, thank you for that.